One thing I've learned studying history is that it's often tempting to tell a more simple and more satisfying story about what's really a messy and complicated past. So the answer that I would want to give you now about inspiring teachers or bold choices would probably be inaccurate. I think maybe more to the point is, why do I stay a historian? What keeps inspiring me in this field? And I think there are a lot of reasons, and I think they really come down to the fact that historians get to have it all, that we get to look at a subject that embraces so many other areas of study, from economics to the environment to human psychology, the social sciences. We get to write both articles and books. We get to talk about big problems that even affect the world today, and yet still also talk about particular human stories that can be fascinating to a general public. And I really don't think it gets better than that. In 2011, I wrote a book called The Climate of Rebellion in the Early Modern Ottoman Empire. And that actually goes all the way back to work I had done as a graduate student, trying to understand this big turn of fortunes in the Middle East, going back to the 1500s and 1600s. Why it was that the Ottoman Empire, which had been expanding, growing, conquering territory, suddenly fell into a protracted period of political turmoil, crisis, and population stagnation. And it turned out, much to my surprise as a researcher more than a decade ago, that the answer came down largely to its ecological vulnerabilities and vulnerabilities to the climatic changes of the Little Ice Age. So that really set my research off in a different direction, which would eventually take me to North America. Why I moved all the way from the Middle East to colonial America is a bit of a longer story, and it has, I think, like most academic stories, both intellectual and personal motivations. The personal motivations are maybe easier to explain. I finished graduate school, started a job at a smaller college, we had a young daughter to raise, and it made sense to do work in America, which to me was in some ways a more interesting and foreign place, having not done much American history before. But there were intellectual motivations too. When I wrote my history about the Ottoman Empire, I was writing about the fate of a large empire, largely drawn from sources based in the imperial center. And what I wanted to do for the second book was to look at how people dealt with climate change, with the Little Ice Age in particular, on a smaller, a more human scale. In cases where we're looking at the responses, the adaptations of small groups or individuals, yet also in a case when it really mattered. Colonial America really captured that, because here we have these small expeditions of dozens to maybe a few thousand people, who need to deal with both unexpected climate as well as the climatic extremes inherent in North America and inherent to the Little Ice Age. So this was a story that fascinated me intellectually, but also fit what I could do as a professor at the time. Everything was a surprise, starting with how little I really knew about this period, maybe how little anyone really knew about this period. It's remarkable how, beyond the names of a few famous explorers, De Soto, Coronado, we don't always know much about this period. It's one of those forgotten centuries of American history. But more than just learning the basics of the expeditions, of their names, of their dates, of their circumstances, of the kinds of sources we have, it was a surprise to me how many fascinating little twists and turns there were along the way. Some of these I had heard of before, but I couldn't really believe it until I saw the sources. And while this might sound strange for someone who set out to write a history of colonial America and the Little Ice Age, I was genuinely surprised by how much climate mattered. I knew it was going to play some role, both the surprise of encountering a new continent with a new type of climate, as well as the extremes of the Little Ice Age. But to see those turn up as defining problems of the expeditions over and over again surprised even me, and I hope that readers find it both surprising and fascinating as well. I think there are three things I'd like readers to take away most. First is just how interesting these expeditions are as human stories, as well as a historically consequential episode. So just to read it for the sake of finding out what happened and why, and how people in these extreme circumstances either survived or failed. A second thing that I'd want readers to take away is how many more tools we have now to do history. Not just early colonial history, but history in general. How not only work in new historical research, in gathering the evidence, of assembling the evidence, of telling new stories and testing them, but also the new tools that have come from archaeology and other sciences. So I'd like readers to see how much more we can understand about even what we think we know by turning back to the hard physical evidence and new tools, new methods to examine it, whether they come from climatology or paleopathology or numerous other disciplines that we can bring to bear on the human past now. A third thing I'd want readers to get out of this is what we might learn by looking at past experiences of climatic extremes, of unexpected extreme weather or climatic change, and what that might tell us for a world facing global warming today. I don't want to imply that there are straightforward, obvious policy lessons that come from this. The lessons from the past usually come to us more in the form of parables, or maybe I'd even say the form of wisdom, the wisdom that comes from having seen others in similar circumstances, and trying to then have a better sense of what might come and how we might respond to it more appropriately.